The professor stood in front of the entire class, and wept. Not because of the grade. Because of what was written at the top of the paper. His hands trembled. The room fell completely silent. 60 students held their breath. No one had ever seen Professor Harold Mercer like this, not in 22 years of teaching. He was known for iron discipline, cold logic, and a complete intolerance for anything that couldn't be proven by data. But today, something had broken through that wall. He slowly lowered the paper to the desk, removed his reading glasses, and pressed his fingers to his eyes. What had this student written? What could possibly reduce a man like this to tears in front of his entire class? To understand that, we need to go back 3 weeks. Professor Harold Mercer had spent 22 years at the university teaching behavioral science. He had 3 published books, a PhD from a prestigious institution, and a reputation that stretched far beyond the campus walls. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant man. But brilliance, in his case, came wrapped in arrogance. His classroom had rules. Strict ones. No phones. No interruptions. No excuses. And absolutely, under no circumstances, no religious observance during class time. He had once sent a student home for quietly reading a small prayer book before lecture began. Another time, he had publicly humiliated a young man who had asked to step out briefly for Friday prayers. "This is a place of science," he would say, adjusting his glasses. "Leave your superstitions at the door." His students feared him. Some respected him. None dared challenge him. Until the day a young woman named Nadia enrolled in his class. Nadia was 21 years old. She had transferred from another state, carrying with her a full academic scholarship and a quiet, unshakable sense of faith. She wore a plain black hijab, a long dark coat, and carried her books in a worn canvas bag that had clearly traveled many miles. She was not loud. She was not confrontational. But there was something in her stillness, a kind of certainty, that people noticed the moment she entered a room. On her very first day in Professor Mercer's behavioral science class, she sat in the 3rd row, second seat from the left. She arranged her notebook carefully, uncapped her pen, and waited. The professor walked in. He scanned the room as he always did, a habit of assessment, and his gaze landed on her for exactly 1 second longer than the others. He said nothing. Class began. For 2 weeks, Nadia was the model student. Her notes were meticulous. Her contributions during discussion were precise and thoughtful. Even Professor Mercer, who rarely acknowledged anyone, had nodded once, almost imperceptibly, when she had answered a particularly difficult question about cognitive bias. But everything changed on the day of the midterm exam. The morning of the midterm, Nadia arrived early. The exam hall was large, a converted auditorium used for formal assessments. Students filed in gradually, the low hum of anxiety filling the space. Pencils clicked. Water bottles were arranged. Someone quietly reviewed flashcards near the back. Nadia placed her bag under the seat, took out 2 pens, and sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap. Then, she bowed her head slightly and closed her eyes. She was making dua, a silent, private prayer that took no more than 30 seconds. But Professor Mercer, who had entered through the side door and was reviewing the exam papers at the front, looked up. He walked toward her. Slowly. Deliberately. He stopped beside her desk and said, in a voice loud enough for the nearest students to hear. "Miss Nadia. What exactly are you doing?" She looked up calmly. "I was praying, Professor." His jaw tightened. "Not in my exam hall. Not on my time. You want to pray, you do it at home. While you are in this room, you follow academic protocol. Are we clear?" A few students exchanged glances. No one spoke. Nadia held his gaze for a moment, not defiantly, but steadily. "Yes, Professor," she said quietly. And she picked up her pen. The exam began. 3 hours. 40 questions. 2 essay sections covering everything from Pavlovian conditioning to modern theories of social behavior. For the other students, the clock was an enemy. Pencils scratched furiously. Erasers dragged across paper. Someone near the back let out a slow, trembling exhale. But Nadia wrote with the quiet steadiness of someone who had prepared not just with her mind, but with something deeper. She did not rush. She did not freeze. She moved through each question as though she had seen them before, not because she had cheated, but because she had genuinely understood. And understanding, as any true scholar knows, is a different thing entirely from memorization. With 15 minutes remaining, she set down her pen, read through her answers once, and made 3 small corrections. Then, at the top of the first page, before her name, before the date, she wrote something. Just a few words. No one saw what it was. Not the students beside her. Not the exam proctor collecting papers at the door. She handed in her exam and walked out into the morning sunlight without looking back. She had no idea what those few words were about to do. Professor Harold Mercer sat alone in his office that evening, grading exams. He had done this hundreds of times. It was routine. Mechanical, almost. He would read, mark, move on. Emotion had no place in the process. He worked through the stack methodically. Some strong papers. Several disappointing ones. One student had written the same answer twice in different sections, which told him more about panic than preparation. He was halfway through the stack when he reached Nadia's paper. He noticed the handwriting first, unusually clean for someone who had been writing for 3 hours under pressure. Then he noticed the score building as he read through each answer. Correct. Correct. Partially correct, but the reasoning was sophisticated enough that he made a note. Correct. Exceptional. By the time he reached the essay sections, he was sitting forward in his chair. She had not just answered the questions. She had answered them in a way that suggested she had been thinking about these ideas long before she walked into his classroom. She drew connections he had not asked for. She challenged one of his premises in the second essay, politely, rigorously, with sources, and she was right. He sat back. And then he looked at the top of the first page. He read what she had written there. He read it again. And something happened in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. At the top of the paper, above her name, above the date, Nadia had written 4 words. Bismillah ir-Rahman ir-Rahim. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. That was all. No explanation. No apology. No provocation. Just those 4 words, the same words Muslims have written at the beginning of their work for over 1400 years. A declaration not of protest, but of purpose. A reminder to herself, before anything else, of who she was and in whose name she had prepared. Professor Mercer stared at those words for a long time. He was not a religious man. He had not been to a church since his mother's funeral, 9 years ago. He had spent his career teaching that human behavior could be explained entirely through stimulus, response, and cognitive pattern. But something about those 4 words, written so quietly, so matter-of-factly, at the top of the highest-scoring exam he had graded in 11 years of teaching at this institution, reached past all of that. It was not the words themselves that undid him. It was the combination. The highest score he had ever given. And at the top of that paper, a prayer. She had been forbidden from praying in his classroom. She had said nothing. She had simply prayed at the top of the page, in the only space that belonged entirely to her. Harold Mercer, professor of behavioral science, placed the paper face down on his desk, removed his glasses, and pressed his hands to his face. And for the first time in a very long time, he wept. 3 days later, Professor Mercer returned the exams. He stood at the front of the room as always, same suit, same posture, same reading glasses. On the surface, nothing had changed. But the students noticed something. He was quieter than usual. Not cold, just quiet. Thoughtful in a way that was different from his usual calculated stillness. He announced the class average. He made 2 brief comments about common errors. Then he held up one paper. "There is an exam here," he said, "that I want to address directly." He paused. It received a score of 98. The highest score in this class since I began teaching at this institution. The 2 missing points are, frankly, a matter of academic debate, not error. He looked around the room. Then his eyes settled on Nadia. "Miss Nadia. Would you come forward, please?" She stood. She walked to the front. He handed her the paper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in front of 60 students, Professor Harold Mercer said something that no one in that room ever expected to hear from him. "I owe you an apology." The room went completely still. 3 weeks ago I told you not to pray in my classroom. I told you this was a place of science and that religion had no place here. He paused. I was wrong. Not about the rules of academic conduct. But about the assumption behind them. I assumed that faith and intellect were opposed. Your paper proved me wrong in the clearest way I have ever been proven wrong in 22 years. He looked at her directly. His voice, for once, carried no authority, only honesty. Whatever you wrote at the top of that page, whatever that means to you, don't stop. Nadia held the exam paper in both hands. She looked at the score in the corner. 98. She looked at the professor's handwritten note in the margin of her second essay, Exceptional Reasoning. Revisit premise in published edition. Then she looked up at him. Thank you, Professor, she said. Her voice was composed. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Simply, present. She could have said more. Anyone watching might have expected more, a speech, an emotion, a moment of visible victory. But Nadia understood something that very few 21-year-olds understand, that some moments do not need to be claimed. They simply need to be witnessed. She turned and walked back to her seat. But then she paused, halfway down the aisle, and turned back. Professor Mercer, she said. He looked at her. The words I wrote at the top, there's something we say before we begin anything important. Before we eat, before we study, before we take an exam. She paused. They mean, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. She looked at him steadily. I wasn't defying you. I was asking for help from the one I believe gives all understanding. The room remained silent. Professor Mercer nodded, once, slowly. His jaw moved as though he might say something. Then he pressed his lips together and turned to the whiteboard. Class continued. But nothing in that room was quite the same. That semester, something shifted in Professor Mercer's classroom. He did not convert. He did not announce a change. He simply opened slightly. A door that had been sealed by years of certainty cracked open an inch. He began, for the first time, to include a unit in his behavioral science course on the psychology of faith. Not to promote it. Not to dismiss it. Simply to study it, as behavior, as cognition, as something millions of human beings experience and that science, he now admitted, had not fully explained. And Nadia graduated with the highest GPA in her department. On the day of her graduation ceremony, she received a card in the mail. No return address. Inside, handwritten in careful, slightly formal penmanship. Whatever you write at the top of the page next, write it first. She knew immediately who it was from. She smiled, folded the card, and placed it between the pages of her notebook, the same worn notebook she had carried into that lecture hall on her very first day. This is what faith does. Not always dramatically. Not always visibly. Sometimes it simply sits at the top of a page, quietly, in 4 words, and waits for the right person to read it. And when they do, when someone who has spent a lifetime saying, "Prove it," suddenly finds themselves unable to argue with the score on that paper, with the composure in that young woman's eyes, with the words that asked not for attention but for help. Something happens in the chest. Something that data cannot measure, and silence cannot contain. Allah gives understanding to whom He wills. And sometimes, He places His mercy in the most unexpected places. In a student's exam. At the top of a page. Bismillah ir Rahman ir Rahim.